associate provost here at the University of Florida. This is my first year. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this event, co-sponsored by the Hamilton Center and also the Department of Economics. I'm especially excited to introduce my dear friend, Melissa Kearney, who is the Neil Moskowitz Professor of Economics at the University of Maryland. She's also the director of the Economic Strategy Group at the Aspen Institute. Melissa is one of my favorite economists. Recently, the Washington Post says she's a self-described MIT-trained economist. I also describe her as an MIT-trained economist. She's just got one of the most broad and deep research agendas. Some of her work is on skill-biased technological change, and I have to tell you how many times I've read that paper and I'm still not sure I get it, all the way to papers on the impact of watching 16 and Pregnant on teen childbearing. When she's a serious economist, but also loves to wrestle with big ideas and just ask some of the greatest questions. When she told me that she was going to write this book, I thought, what a service she's going to do, and how brave she is. It's been a very interesting ride for her as this really well-researched, well-executed book has come out, and I'm just so glad that we are able to bring you down to the swamp to have this
from
conversation.
From one swamp to another.
Exactly, from one swamp to another. That's right. Will Imboden, of course, needs no introduction, and I will turn it over to the two of you.
Okay, great. Thank you
Thanks,
very much.
Diane.
Yeah, thank you, Diane, and great to see everyone here, and especially since Melissa has also been described as the most talked about economist in America this year. We are particularly fortunate to have her visit us here in Gainesville. So rather than torment us with regression slide after regression slide, I say that as a historian who might as well be showing me a foreign language, those things. We decided to do this as a conversation, since, as you'll find, I think Melissa can communicate a lot of these very sophisticated and well-researched ideas in terms accessible to those of us from different specializations and no specialization whatsoever. So we're going to dive into it. I'll do a structured conversation with her, and then we'll certainly allow time for questions from the audience as well. And hopefully most of you have your books, but the only thing I'll say is you are forbidden from leaving here without a complimentary copy of the book, courtesy of the Hamilton Center. So, all right. So, Melissa, let's begin at the beginning with you intellectually. As an economist, how did you first become interested in studying the economics of the family and marriage?
I actually have always been interested in questions of people's economic and social lives. And so now when I'm asked to reflect, how did I wind up here? I started even as an undergrad researching topics related to this, and I think it probably relates to sort of living one of those stories in America of social mobility. And, my own family story, I think a lot of us draw our inspiration from our own lives, and I was, one of those kids whose grandparents came from Italy. They had no education, thinking it was, I was always sort of fascinated by how my grandmothers and her sister and then my mom made it in America, and was very aware of the fact that I had educational and economic opportunities that my parents and grandparents didn't. And so then I went to college sort of fascinated by those topics and wound up studying a lot of sociology and economics and public policy, and that sort of shaped my research agenda since, studying poverty and inequality and families and labor markets in America.
Terrific. Well, and this, I guess, a good segue. In economics, especially for those of us here who are non-economists, how common is it to study families? And what would make the way an economist studies a family different than, say, how a sociologist or, heaven forbid, a historian would so?
Yeah, it's one of those things where some economists think it's too much like sociology, and then sociologists get really annoyed when economists study it. So we're a little bit of a niche group, but really, a married couple and a family and a household is the fundamental economic unit of our society and our economy. And so, to my mind, it's very, very natural for economists to study these questions. And someone's decision about marriage and family formation and having kids have a lot of economic consequences and are reflective of their economic situation. And so I think both as cause and effect, these decisions are fundamentally economic questions. And so for me, it's very natural to use my training as an economist to study these questions. You know, I love that the Nobel Prize was just given to a woman who studies women's decisions and the history of women's decisions about work and career and family and fertility. And so I think that sort of puts a pretty big stamp of approval on the importance of these questions and the economic approach to them.
That's Claudia Golden, by the way, right? Yeah, so
Yeah.
Of Harvard, who I should mention a week before she got the Nobel Prize in economics had reached out to Melissa to congratulate her, and what a terrific book this is. So, as if you needed any more validation.
No, that was validating.
Yeah.
But, you know, how an economist and how I approach these questions is really, you know, sort of, I think, for better or worse, I of course think for better, we sort of strip the question down to really sort of fundamental principles and factors, as opposed to a way a sociologist or a psychologist would study issues of marriage or family, where they live in the nuance and think very carefully about the different relationships and roles people play in households. And so I draw a lot on those literatures, and I cite a lot of those studies in the book. But the way I think about it is really trying to think about, in broad strokes, in the aggregate, what do we see as the major trends? And then in broad strokes, you know, again, like deliberately setting a lot of the nuance and complication aside, that allows me to draw a little bit more, in my mind, just very clear and incisive conclusions. And that doesn't mean all of the nuance and exceptions aren't important, but I view them as nuances and exceptions as opposed to like aggregate trends and rules, you know, that govern the data writ large.
Yeah, you got a big data set there.
I got a big data set, and I have very sort of parsimonious fundamental ideas, and you know, hopefully we'll break some of that down. But so, you know, in the way I describe marriage, which is very consistent with the economics paradigm, it's like people making the decision to join forces in a long-term contract to pool their resources and commit to producing and consuming goods together over their lifetime, which maybe isn't how everybody thinks about marriage, right? But like actually fundamentally that's what it is. And it turns out that's part of the reason why it's so important to kids.
Yeah, yeah. And we will come back to that because I do want to ask about the L word, love, but okay. Love, all right, okay. Well, so let's talk. Let's pivot off what you were just talking about there about these broad trends, and this is where we'll look at the intersection of economics and history. Frankly, from the perspective of children in particular, what has happened to marriage rates over the past several decades? What are the trends we're seeing?
This is really what I'm trying to draw attention to in this book, and I don't think is sufficiently appreciated, which is that in the past 40 years, we've had a pretty major change in the way kids in this country are raised. And specifically, I'm referring to the fact that 40 years ago, 77% of kids in the US were raised in a married parent home, and now just barely over 60% of kids in the US are raised in a married parent home. So that is a fundamental shift, and it matters, right, for all the reasons we'll talk about, but it matters. And the other thing that's really, really important to recognize is this has happened predominantly, this decline in the share of kids being raised in a married parent home has happened predominantly outside the college-educated class. And that matters too, because we know that our country has massive amounts of inequality. We know that kids now from different backgrounds live in very different spheres with different opportunities. And a lot of that is driven by the fact that outside of the college-educated class, increasingly kids are growing up in one-parent homes, which tend to have fewer resources, right? So that's really the sort of story I'm telling in the book about what's happened to marriage and how that matters for kids. So let me just be very specific. Kids who were born to moms with a 4-year college degree, in 1980, 90% of them lived in a married parent home. Now, like 84%. Just a small decrease, which is actually pretty astounding given how much bigger that group is. Like so many more moms now have a college degree, so it's a more heterogeneous, less select group, and yet still we see that marriage is holding steady among the kids who are born to college-educated moms. In the 1980s, people were really worried because there were high rates of kids living in single-parent homes for the most disadvantaged moms, like teen moms, moms without a high school degree. It was 80% back then. Now it's 60%. And I think what would...
Wait, clarify that. 60%
of kids whose moms don't have a high school degree now live in a married parent home.
Okay.
But even more surprising, I think, to most people is the fact that there's been a tremendous steady decrease in the share of kids living with married parent homes in the middle of the education or income distribution. Kids born to moms with a high school degree, which is actually the majority of kids. That's sort of the typical mom in this country has a high school degree, some college, but not a four-year degree. 23 percentage point decrease in the likelihood that they're growing up in a married parent home. I mean, that's huge. Yeah. And so now the real gap, it's not that, 40 years ago we were really worried that teen moms, the most disadvantaged, had elevated rates of single motherhood. Now it's really the college educated class that stands out from everybody else. This really advantaged group is raising their kids predominantly in this advantaged situation, or privileged situation, as I refer to it in the title, of raising their kids in married parent homes. And there's a 20 percentage point gap in the likelihood that other kids are living with married parents. And so that, that's why I tell this story. It's really this both reflects and exacerbates income inequality in this country and undermines social mobility.
So if those are the trends, let's talk about causality. Right? So what are some of the factors that are maybe causing this very dramatic increase in kids living with single parent, unmarried parents?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard question, but one I grapple with pretty extensively and directly in the book. Here's my sort of overview telling of what's happened. So let's go back to the 60s and 70s, which is sort of before the period I'm really focused on in my book. In the 60s and 70s, there was dramatic cultural, social changes in the U.S., right? Changes ideas about the importance of marriage, the importance of being married to have a kid, a change in gender norms. And what we saw in those 2 decades is that marriage decreased basically throughout the population equally. Marriage fell for everybody, college educated, middle educated, less educated. And then in the 80s and 90s, you see a really big divergence. And that the decline in marriage stops for the college educated. Okay, so the marriage rates among college educated adults and parents essentially remain stable, but they continue to fall for everybody else. And my read of the data and the massive amounts of evidence on what happened is that you took this sort of like new social paradigm where marriage was no longer such an important social convention, and you add on top of that a whole bunch of economic shocks that really disadvantaged non-college educated workers. Some of it was skill-biased technological change, right? So some of these sort of labor market, global labor market, secular labor market trends that eroded the economic position of non-college educated men, both in an absolute sense and relative to women. Here I'm gonna sound very romantic again, it eroded the economic value proposition of marriage. So you had women now, they had the ability to provide for themselves economically. The men they were partnering with were more likely to be out of work or have stagnant wages. And so you combine that with a social convention that's sort of more accepting of non-marriage and non-marital childbearing, and you get this erosion of marriage outside of the college-educated class. And so ultimately the story I'm telling is one of both social change and economic shocks interacting. And it's not just trends. We do have really good evidence of a causal effect. To go back to your initial question, like for example, there's a study that's very compelling in economics that shows that when the US faced greater import competition from China, such that certain communities saw well-paying manufacturing jobs that were really, great middle-class jobs, family-sustaining jobs for men without a college degree, when those jobs went away in those communities, you saw a decrease in marriage and you saw an increase in the share of kids living with single moms. Similarly, when, in communities that were really, their employment was heavily invested in like operations or production jobs that were replaced by industrial robots, non-college educated men lost access to these middle-class jobs, and we saw a reduction in marriage and an increase in the share of kids living in single mother homes. So it's not just a correspondence of these trends, but there's real reason to think there's a causal line here from the erosion of men's economic position to an increase in the share of kids living with just their moms.
Yeah, okay. And of course, the foreign policy maven in me can't help but notice that it's all blamed ultimately on China. So
No,
it's
not. I actually just think that the China shock is a very good way to identify a causal link,
Yes.
but I actually don't want to overstate. That's just one causal, like very specific context, but there's a lot of other sort of labor market trends and changes that have happened.
Yeah.
And by the way, we also know that like where there's a loss of jobs and a loss of employment, there are other social challenges follow. And so the story I'm telling is one that's described in the social science literature as what's happened to the marriageability of men. But it's not just that they've become less marriageable in some communities because they're out of work. We also know, again, like men who are out of work are more likely to struggle with substance abuse or emotional challenges that would make them either feel less able or eager to commit to taking care of a family, or are viewed by the women that they're partnering with as less desirable marriage partners.
Yeah, and in more seriousness, setting aside my crack about China, it's a good reminder of the complex interplay of cultural, social, psychological, and especially economic factors.
Yep,
Yeah,
exactly.
So we'll probe in a little more on that. Are there differences by race and ethnicity in the percentage of kids living in households with married parents? And if there are, did you probe any of the possible factors behind those discrepancies?
Yes. So the story that I'm really focusing on in this 40-year period is one of this widening education class gap, but that piles on top of racial and ethnic differences. Okay, and so in the early 80s, we already had a pretty large gap in the share of Black and white children in this country growing up with married parents. That has widened over time. And within white families, Hispanic families, and Black families, in the US Census, you see that we've also had this emergence of a college gap. So I'll give you some specific numbers. So now 77% of white children in the US, or let me be very precise, children whose moms identify in the census as white, 77% of those children live in married parent homes, as compared to only 38% of children whose moms identify as Black. A notable exception to all these trends are children whose moms identify as ethnically Asian. 88% of them are living in married parent homes. And then within groups, there's also this education divide. So, the children of white moms, they're much more likely to live in a married parent home if their mom has a college degree or not. Same with the children whose moms identify as Black. They're twice as likely to live in a married parent home if the mom is four-year college educated. Still much lower than all the other race and ethnic groups, but you're at 60% versus 30%. So that, you've got basically what we have going on is class and race and ethnic gaps. The reason why I say the Asian Americans look like such an exception is because across the education distribution, the children are all living in married parent homes at greater than like 80%. And so you don't see this emergence of an education gap for Asians. You asked about can the economic story describe these differences? So in a very descriptive sense, if I look at this marriageability story and what happened to the economic, the earnings of men in these different groups. I've got 12 groups, right? I've got the 4 race and ethnic groups combined with the 3 education groups. The groups for which the men did the best over this time period in terms of seeing their earnings increase, they had the smallest reduction in marriage. And the groups for whom the men did the worst, with the exception of the non-college educated Asian men, they are off the regression line. They saw the largest decreases in marriage, or the largest, yeah. And similarly, if you look at women relative to men, the groups for whom women did the best relative to men, or men did the worst relative to women in their group, that's where we saw the largest reductions in marriage. But this is actually really interesting to be clear. College-educated women have done very, very well over this time period, but they're still getting married, right, and raising their kids in married parent homes at high rates. The relative economic position of women relative to men is actually lowest for the 4-year college-educated women. So even though those women do very well, college-educated men are still crushing it. So actually, the sort of relative decrease in men's economic position has been steady for the most educated, highest income groups. And so that's why these trends all line up with this story. And then again, under this story, we have some very good studies showing us that, in specific contexts, we see that there's a causal link here.
Yeah, wow, very interesting. Well, let's drill down a little bit on, what some of the distinguishing factors here, since you've been talking a lot about marriage, and of course in your book you argue that having married parents makes a difference for kids. Is it really having married parents, or is it just, say, having two cohabitating adults in the home?
This is a really important question. So because I take this economic framework on it, the sort of lens I'm bringing to this issue is really one about resources. And so in the way I model the issue and study it, I'm thinking about resources. And so then I'm like, okay, well, married parents tend to have two parents in the household, and two parents tend to have more resources than one, both in terms of income, time, emotional bandwidth, a whole bunch of things. We just see that married parent households have more income. Most married moms work now, so you really do, like, if you just look at median household income, it's twice as high in married parent versus one parent households. So then, with this framework, if two parents were to commit to being in a long-term relationship, even if they don't sign this marriage contract and they pooled their resources and they raise their kids together, there shouldn't be any difference in kids' outcomes. The issue is that in the US, that's not really what cohabitation among parents looks like. So while in theory, cohabitation could deliver the exact same resources and benefits to kids, in practice it doesn't, because kids whose parents are unmarried at the time of birth, even if they're cohabiting, are very unlikely to be together by the time the kid is 5. Many of those dads are not in the child's life at all by the time they're 12. And so cohabitation, for whatever reason, in the US in particular, this is different than in many European settings, it's just a very, very fragile arrangement. And so that's why in practice, this reduction in marriage winds up really mattering for kids, because the practical consequence of the reduction in marriage is a rise in the share of kids living in one-parent homes.
Okay. So in other words, there is something substantive to those marital vows. It's not just a piece of paper then.
So it's really interesting. So, I don't delve too much into like what is it about marriage that makes it so sticky, but there are different ideas. Some of it is there is this institutional factor that makes it harder to separate. So when things get hard, which they inevitably do, especially when there's kids around, it's just harder to exit. And so then, one idea is like, so then parents stay together, and that's good for the kids. Another idea is like, just once you've made the ex-ante commitment, then that changes the whole way you parent together and live together and, commit to it. And so there's do life together. And so there's different, people who sort of study and theorize about what it is about marriage that makes it stickier, have a variety of ideas. And then, of course, there's something to be said for like, the people who just commit to being together at the beginning, their relationships, many of them are presumably just more stronger, which is why they were willing to make that commitment. And so even among parents or even among adults who have a kid together, if we see them just cohabiting but not marrying, that might be telling us something about the strength of their relationship to begin with.
Okay, very interesting. So, aside from greater economic security in adulthood, as you're looking at some of these long-term outcomes, in what other ways do kids raised in two-parent homes do better than kids raised in a single-parent home?
Yeah, so this is one of those things that like the data is just irrefutable here. And so let me be very clear. I know there are a lot of kids who are raised by single moms who are phenomenally successful. And I know there are a lot of kids raised in two-parent homes who have a lot of struggles. But on average, when you just look at the millions of kids who have grown up in the US over the past 40 years, it's very, very clear in the data that kids who are coming from married two-parent homes are at an advantage in all sorts of ways. So the first thing that social scientists do when they try to make these comparisons is make sure we're statistically adjusting for like the education, the race, the geography of where they live of the parents. So we're trying to compare the children of parents who are otherwise similar. And what we see is that kids who are growing up in married parent versus single parent homes, well, one, they're much less likely to live in poverty when they're growing up. They're less likely to get in trouble in school. They're less likely to have behavioral struggles. They're more likely to graduate high school. They're more likely to graduate college. they're more likely to grow up to be married and have kids inside of a marriage themselves. So there's a lot of sort of, in my view of it, reproduction of advantage and disadvantage across the generations. So then the sort of statistical exercise is, well, what's driving that? And income is a big part of it, right? So again, I'm not going to show you the regressions, but when you put income in the regression, the gaps in kids' outcomes shrinks. Now, the social scientist who is really averse to suggesting that marriage matters then says, aha, it's mostly income, so stop focusing on marriage. But the thing is, marriage is the factor that's delivering that second parent's income into the household. So it's all very well that in our regression we can control for income, but in the real world we don't control for income. And in the real world you have a single mom who's bringing in like $40,000 on her own versus the married couple where maybe she's bringing in $40,000 and her husband is also bringing in $40,000. And so that income is a very big mechanism. But it's not the only mechanism. So, you know, even when we control for income, and let's just heuristically, it depends on exactly the context and the outcome. Let's just say that sort of explains half of the gap. What are the other things we know that we have studies on? We know that kids who are growing up with married parents have a lot more parental time investment. Again, this isn't rocket science. 2 parents tend to have more time to give their kid than 1. And, you know, if you're trying to do it all by yourself, you're the one paying all the bills, doing all the cleaning, mowing the lawn, doing the cooking, trying to help your kid with their homework, driving around. You don't have as much time to just sit down and read to your kid or help them with their homework. So, like, again, none of this is to be, like, impugn single moms. It's just to, like, recognize the reality when there's 2 parents in the house, there's more time. And we see that very clearly, that kids in married parent homes get more time with parents. And we, you know, then the question is, does parental time affect kids' outcomes? And it looks like there's some causal evidence that more parental time investment matters for kids. The third sort of major bucket of resources that I think there's really compelling evidence on is, I'm going to call it like the lower levels of stress in married parent homes. Again, recognizing full well that many married parent homes have high levels of stress, but there's tons of research, mostly from outside of economics and, let's say, development psychology. There's a lot of this that just documents the high rates of toxic stress in single mother households. Again, those are like under-resourced situations, really hard to doing all of this by yourself. There's more likely to be stress. Behavioral economists will write about cognitive bandwidth. Again, if you're the only person and you're trying to help their kid with their homework at the same time you're worrying how you're going to pay rent, you're more likely to have less cognitive bandwidth. And so when I look at, you know, all of the evidence showing that married and single parents tend to parent differently, like you see, you know, more of the kind of nurturing parent that development psychologists say is good for kids in married parent homes, I am less inclined to read from that and think, well, the kinds of people who get married are just more patient people, which is what some people say if they really want this all to be about personal characteristics. I will be the first to admit, when I get home, if I'm stressed from work, there are many times I'm just too stressed to parent the way I want, and I turn to my husband, I'm like, you're on. Like, I'm going to decompress, right? And so it's just...
I'm grabbing that bottle of wine and
head outside. I'm going for a walk, right? Like, I'm going to put it...
I've been there.
Right, and so, like, it's, again, like, I try to write this all very much from a place of empathy, right? I think part of, you know, it's really hard to do this by yourself, and so I don't think it's surprising that married parent homes tend to also have more emotional bandwidth to do the kind of parenting that's beneficial to kids. So for all of, those are like all of the mechanisms that I think help explain why we see kids from married parent homes doing better.
Well, and again, let's drill down a little bit more there, because you've made a number of references to single moms, and I think that's just reflecting the reality that most single parenting is done by single moms.
80% of single parent households are single mother households.
So does that have disproportionate effects for boys as opposed to girls being raised by a single parent?
Yeah, and I think this is another reason why it's like really, really imperative for us to try and break this cycle, because we have millions of boys now growing up without a dad in their house, and we have an increasing amount of evidence that that's particularly hard for boys. I'm thinking in particular of 2 studies that different teams of economists have written in the past 10 years that use administrative data. One of the papers uses administrative data on all school kids in Florida. And they basically...
Can you tell us what administrative data is?
Like they have all the records from all of the schools matched with household characteristics of kids in the state of Florida. And another one of these papers uses data sets that similarly track kids, their school outcomes. They have social workers interviewing parents in the household, observing the parenting. What these studies find is that the gender gap in kids' outcomes, that now, by the way, favors girls. Boys are, let me just level set. Boys are more likely to get in trouble in school. They're more likely to get in trouble with the law. They're less likely to graduate high school. Young men are less likely to go to college. So boys in this country are struggling. What these 2 studies show is that gender gap in kids' outcomes favoring girls is larger for kids from single mother homes than married parent homes. Meaning the sort of excess rate at which boys get in trouble is, larger if the boy, compared to his sister even in some of these analyses, is coming from a home without a dad. And then the paper by Marion Bertrand and Jessica Pond goes even further to say, okay, what's driving that? What are the mechanisms? And they're very careful to say it's not that these kids attend different kind of schools that benefit girls, or they live in neighborhoods where we see girls doing better. It's really about the household disadvantage. And what they show and what they find is that indeed boys from those households are less likely to have time with their mom, and they're more likely to receive harsh parenting. Okay, like all the differences in parental investments that I was talking about. But really interestingly, what's driving the bulk of the difference is that boys seem to be particularly sensitive to these things, which is super interesting. So what does that mean in plain English? It means I have a boy and I have a girl. If I ignore them because I'm busy, right? If I yell at them and am harsh and spank them, my girl is probably not that much, is really not much more likely to go to school and bully somebody at recess and get herself suspended. But my boy is. And so I want to be careful because I don't think it's right to infer from all this that girls aren't struggling or they're not responsive to the absence of a dad in their house in a negative way. But again, from development psychology literature, we see that on average girls internalize their struggles and boys externalize it. But if boys are externalizing this in ways that gets them in trouble in school, makes it less likely that they're going to graduate, more likely to get in trouble in the law, it's going to be more likely to sort of derail their educational and economic trajectory. So anyway, we have evidence on that, which again is part of what convinced me, this is really important for us to pay attention to. We just can't be resigned to millions of boys, again, in particular in less economically advantaged groups, growing up without dads in their houses. And then, by the way, let's think about the cyclical behavior of this. And then we're back to talking about marriageable men. How are these boys going to grow up to be the kinds of men and dads that we think, families need when they grew up without that kind of role model in their house?
The downstream effects there,
They're
it's
huge.
a difficult cycle. So
Do you want to come in? Someone wants to come in.
come on in, and we got plenty of seats over on this side too. So friendly group here. So all right, so let's talk a little bit on the autobiographical note, because you reference this in the book. In college, you worked as an intern at a welfare to work program.
Yeah.
How did that shape your perspective on this question of single parenting?
Yeah, this is one of those, I don't know if you have something like this at Florida. So where I went to college, one of the classes for their gift back to the university paid for students to have internships in agencies that worked for structural change, which was amazing because that meant one summer I could take 2 months off from waitressing to go work at this welfare to work center in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And this was the time of welfare reform experimentation. So in the mid-90s, there was a lot of experimentation going on. States were experimenting with their welfare rules to try and get more women to work, et cetera. So I worked at this welfare to work center. I was a super earnest, rising college junior, and I was working with welfare moms, many of whom were my age, and I was teaching them word processing and business math, it's like preposterous to think about at the time. And then, you know, they had to be in this program in order to keep access to their cash benefits. That's what Connecticut said. If you're on welfare and you want to keep your benefits, you either have to be employed or working towards employment. So I spent the summer working with them, and it was amazing, and it was super eye-opening. You know, it was, I think this also just sort of really in my mind solidified my questions about, these are women my age, they have 2 or 3 kids, none of them are married, I'm in college, how do our lives look so different, right? So then I actually went back and wrote my senior thesis titled The Economic Determinants of Age at First Birth.
And you're writing this as a senior in college?
I'm writing this as a senior in college, and 30 years later, I'm still writing the same kind of stuff. I'm still trying to figure it out, right? And then the other thing that I learned from that summer, that was the summer I was working there, the state of New Jersey had just implemented a family cap policy, which was wound up being part of the National Welfare Reform in '96. A lot of states have rolled it back now. But the idea there was, if you got pregnant when you were on welfare, you couldn't get any more money for the additional child, because the thought was that was incentivizing women who didn't, you know, weren't self-sufficient to keep having more kids. And I remember asking the women, I was like, what do you guys think of this? And there was also this woman in my class who was like 19, and she was pregnant with her 3rd child. That's still very salient to me. And they were like, oh yeah, I definitely, I know so-and-so got pregnant to have another kid. I was like, oh, really? And then actually when I was in grad school, that was my econometrics paper. I was like, I'm going to study this family cap, because by that time it had been implemented in enough states. And what I found was actually the implementation of family cap had a pretty precisely estimated 0 effect on birth rates. And so what did that mean? That meant that the elimination of additional welfare benefits for these women did not lead to fewer births. It just meant to fewer resources for moms and kids.
Meant more poverty.
More poverty.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, that summer was pretty, you know, it still has a profound impact on the research questions I ask and my interest in these questions.
Yeah. So again, a good reminder to the undergraduates here, especially, these are even more formative years for you than you can possibly imagine.
Yeah,
so,
it's true.
Yeah, so, okay, well, we are here at a university. You spoke at Florida State yesterday. Sorry, I should have mentioned it, that other university down the road, right? So they who shall not be named. You're here at the University of Florida today. In theory, at least, universities are supposed to be places where scholars follow the evidence where it leads, ask all sorts of broad questions, engage in free and open discourse on our search for truth and insights into the human condition. But let's be honest, it's difficult for academics to have conversations about these value questions that relates to families and marriage especially. Why do you think that is? Especially since, as you're showing just from the data, we're just talking empiricism here. We're not saying thus saith the Lord or you know, any kind of, you know, natural law principles or anything. So why is it hard to talk about this stuff?
Yeah, I mean.
And how have people responded, your fellow scholars, to this book? Yeah.
It's really hard, and this is, Diane alluded to this, I think why when I decided I had to write this book, a lot of my friends were like, are you sure? Are you sure you want to do this? And
can't you do something on free trade?
Yeah, right. No, it got to the point where, you know, for 2 decades now, I've been in so many policy-focused conversations where we talk all about these challenges: inequality, threats to social mobility, child poverty. And in the data, I mean, that scholars have in front of us, everyone can see very clearly how much family structure matters. But in my experience, then, like, we sort of ignore it for a variety of reasons, and then we talk about, oh, we have to increase the earned income tax credit, we have to improve schools, we have to have stronger safety net programs and labor market institutions, and I am all for that, and I've written plenty of policy pieces advocating for all of that. But every time, like, I've gotten increasingly sort of emboldened in recent years of being like, wait, what about this huge gap in family structure across education groups and race and ethnic groups? Like, we have to talk about that, because it's not surprising that kids get to school already at age 5 with very different experiences and preparation, and those gaps widen over time. And, like, how much are we just going to ask schools to make up for what we see is, like, huge differences in resources in home life? And I think certainly among the academic circles I run in, there's a little bit of that makes us all uncomfortable to talk about because we don't want to sound like we're blaming single moms, which is what's happened in the past. This issue has come up a few times. In the 60s, it was really, Daniel Patrick Moynihan brought up this issue in relation to the emerging gap in two-parent homes between black and white families. And it was pretty quickly dismissed as sort of out of bounds. And so conversation on that was shut down. In the 80s, the topic came back up. William Julius Wilson, who wrote about this marriageable man, brought it back up. And then social scientists, really sort of people were accused of sounding like they were blaming the victim. And the topic got shut down again. And so here I am, not naively, but somewhat optimistically saying, okay, the trends have continued and they've gotten much worse. Let's try to have this conversation again. And I'm trying to do it in a way that very honestly comes from a position of empathy. I feel, I'm optimistic that we should be able to have this conversation and recognize how much harder it is to provide a resourceful home environment with only one parent without sounding like we're blaming the victims. And I again, very genuinely in the book, I'm not blaming moms or even the dads. You don't see the term deadbeat dad in my book anywhere, right? There's a lot of reasons to feel empathy and worried about the men in these affected situations as well. But I really think for most academics, it's a well-intentioned effort to not sound like we're blaming people for their difficult circumstances. But then it's very counterproductive because we ignore one of the most important factors our society is facing in terms of generating inequality, child poverty, and threats to social mobility. Another sort of pushback I'm getting, and this is really interesting, the first tinge of this, before the book came out, probably a year and a half ago, I went to a conference in Europe and presented a lot of this work because I wanted to see what European demographers and economists thought of all this and what they were seeing. And so many of them came up to me and they're like, I can't believe you're saying this. We would never say this here because they're really actually behind us in Europe. So let me be clear. Kids in the US are more likely than in any other country in the world to live in a one-parent home. Okay, this is not an exceptionalism we should be proud of.
Wait, so make sure we all heard that. Than any other country in the world?
Okay, so the Pew Research Center did a survey of 130 countries. So of the 130 countries that they have data for, in the US, by their metrics, 23% of kids live in a one-parent home. The average across their sample of 130 countries is 7%.
Wow.
In Europe, the average is 13%. The only country that's close to us is the UK. Okay. So they're sort of trailing behind us. And they were like, I can't believe you would say this. This is so anti-feminist. And I was like, this is not a feminist success story. Okay, it's not the most economically advantaged women who are finding themselves in large numbers doing this by themselves. And by the way, this is not good for kids. And so I even took this one woman and she was like, I was just commissioned, she just wrote a report for her government, and I won't tell you which government it was, on child poverty. She's like, I never thought to look by family structure. I was like, go back and ask your RA to look by family structure. So it's really interesting. There is a feminist reaction to all this that it sounds to some people like this is anti-feminist to suggest that, women choosing to do this by themselves is putting kids at a disadvantage. And my reaction to that is very few of these women are making anything that looks like a real choice, right? It's a real constrained choice. If my choice is, do I do this by myself or with a guy who's in and out of work, who brings all sorts of other strife, who isn't really committed to this project of raising our kid together, is that really a choice? And I think that's probably a more appropriate way to think about the majority of single moms in this country.
Well, let's pivot off that, talk a little bit about this concept of assortative mating. All right, sounds like a fancy academic term, but I think there's something going on there. So how does that apply to the relationship between educational attainment and marriage likelihood?
And I think the concept of assortative mating very much relates to the framing of this as a privilege issue. So basically,
and that, by the way, again, the title of the book, The Two-Parent Privilege, right? And none of you are leaving here without your copy right there. Okay. So
we know, and this has been true for a long time, and that people of the same social class tend to partner and marry people of the same social class. That's the sort of basic way to think about it. And so what does that mean in practice today in the US? College-educated men and women tend to have kids together and marry each other. High school educated adults tend to have kids together and marry each other, and less educated tend to partner together. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. Some of it is just who you meet, right? Who's everyone meeting in college? That hasn't actually grown that much over time in the US, but actually, what has happened, again, to just sort of really drive home some of these themes is college-educated adults are continuing to marry each other, and non-college educated adults are having kids together, but are increasingly doing so without getting married. And all of this is really important to thinking about what I've called in previous papers the marriage premium for kids. And so how does a kid benefit from whether or not their parents are married? Let's start by thinking about what are the resources the mom brings to the home herself, or with her network, basically. So that's her own earnings, any government program, help she gets, help from her relatives, neighbors, those are mom's resources. And then whether or not sort of the second parent would help the child depends on what her partner or the child's, second parent would bring to the home. And so if you think about, and then we take, those two things and we put them through a production function that gives us kids outcomes, right? We combine our resources, our time, our energy, our emotional support, and we produce kids. Okay, so if you've got college-educated moms assortatively mating with college-educated dads, they both have a lot of resources, and they throw tons of resources at their kids tend to do things like graduate college in high numbers. It's exactly what we see in the data. If you take a teen mom without a high school degree and she assortatively mates with a young man who also doesn't have a high school degree, very limited prospects, and they get together, you see that whether or not they're married, it doesn't really seem to matter for kids' outcomes, right? Their kids are still pretty disadvantaged. If you take a high school educated mom and compare her kids' outcomes to a high school educated mom who's raising her kid with a married partner in the house, again, because of assortative mating, he's probably likely to be in the same sort of class. There's a really big gap in the likelihood of whether their kid avoids poverty or graduates high school. And what does that say? The assortative mating sort of drives what does the pooling of resources do? And this also, by the way, really relates to the issue of, in any given case, whether the parents coming together would help the kid or not really depends on what the second parent would bring in. And it also raises issues of, I know this is beyond assortative mating specifically, but what if the second parent is harmful, right? So nothing I say in the book should be misconstrued to suggest that any child would be better off if an abusive parent stayed in the house, to be clear. But also there's studies in economics that look at what happens if a parent is convicted of a crime. And to get at causality, what some of these researchers have done, when that parent is randomly assigned to a judge who is more likely to put someone convicted of that crime in prison. And it turns out that the child is less likely to get involved with the criminal justice system themselves and more likely to graduate high school. What does that mean? It means that it tells us very clearly when there's a second parent, I'm not saying all parents convicted of a crime would be this way, but on average, when there's a second parent who's a convicted criminal, that actually brings some element of stress or strife or negative influences into the house such that the child actually looks better off if the parent's not there. And so this is really, really important because it's a complete misreading of the book to suggest that I'm saying kids would always do better if there's two parents. What I'm saying is, on average, we know kids do better when there are two parents. But there are clearly circumstances where it wouldn't be better for the kids.
Okay, and very good distinctions and caveats there. I'm going to wrap up with a couple of bigger picture questions for you on the larger context and takeaways for this, and then we are going to turn it over to questions from the audience. So be thinking about your thoughtful and penetrating questions here. So this declining marriage rate, declining number of kids living in married two-parent homes, is not an isolated trend, but it's also been occurring against this backdrop of just declining trust in institutions overall in America. Like we're just going from a higher trust society to a lower one. We don't trust the media as much anymore. The figures show most Americans don't trust the universities, academia anymore. So it's incumbent on us professors thinking about that. Clergy, religious institutions aren't trusted as much anymore as they used to be. Why did you focus on marriage and highlighting that and the consequences of declining really trust in that if people just aren't doing it as much? Why should we focus on that as opposed to all these other institutions?
I mean, first of all, I find all of that so depressing and challenging, right? As people who live in the higher education sphere, right? But I'm actually not sure if people's trust in the institution of marriage is down. So one of the sort of survey pieces of evidence that's quite interesting is that from ethnographic work, when people have gone and interviewed unmarried, low-income parents, they don't actually say they don't like the institution of marriage. So some of the writers who have criticized me in the New Yorker say, like, this is a patriarchal institution and we should be done with it. But you don't really see that so much from the affected communities that I'm writing about. Rather, it seems to me more like people put marriage on a pedestal. And so what you read from the qualitative interviews and ethnographic work from a lot of these, unmarried parents is, I actually really want everything to be in order. I want a partner who has everything in order. We're not ready to get married yet, and I'm going to wait until I find somebody and a relationship that's really ideal. And so, I'm Kathy Eden has a book called, Promises I Can Keep, Why Women Put Motherhood Before Marriage. And it's almost like the bar to marrying somebody is higher than having a child with them. I think I would be less optimistic that we could do anything to turn it around if we really saw people rejecting marriage in large numbers. I would also be less optimistic that marriage is compatible with modern day feminism if, again, we didn't see college educated adults continuing to get married in really high numbers. So maybe it's actually we need more people to have less of an idealized version of marriage. Be sort of more realistic and realize that marriage is hard and that's okay. But I've really come around to think, again, reading these interviews with low-income couples, unmarried couples who show up and you just read about them saying, we want to make this relationship work. We weren't raised by married parents. We don't really know married parents. We have all these barriers. She has anger issues. I have substance abuse issues. How do we make this work? So I think the barriers might be different than just a rejection of the institution.
Yeah. Well, that's actually a great lead up to the final question for me, again, before we're going to turn it over to questions from the audience here. So, and I'm persuaded, okay, I'll admit, I'm persuaded, right? So if the Kearney argument is correct here, and I certainly am, that married two-parent homes are really key to healthy child outcomes, how do we recapture a culture where that's the norm? I mean, how do you change a culture?
Yeah, I mean, this is really hard, and I spend much more of the book trying to convince you that this is a problem we need to address than convincing you I have the answers of how to do it.
There's a sequel, the next book. Okay.
But part of honestly what I'm hoping to do is put this out there. Let's all agree this needs to be on the policy agenda, and then let's collectively across communities actually work on strengthening families. So what I do think is both at a very high level, because thinking back to what I sort of diagnosed as the cause of all this, I think it's both economic and social. I do think we need to improve the economic position of non-college educated men in particular in this country, right? Make more men economically marriageable, both from their own views of themselves and the women that they're partnering with. But at the same time, this is the most controversial line in the book. Frankly, I say we need to reestablish a norm of two-parent households for kids. And this is a really big deal because this gets to people's reluctance to sort of admit that one family structure seems more beneficial for kids than another. But I think the data is pretty clear. So then how do you do that? You know, again, one of the things I would say that sort of weighs on me a lot is that that social convention seems pretty tight among college-educated adults, just based on what we see. So I don't think, again, that this convention is not compatible with modern society. We know, and we have really strong social science evidence saying that messaging matters. What people organically see on TV, what celebrities do, what their local leaders say, what celebrities say, that stuff matters. And so, you know, I don't, just like I'm not.
So you're saying if Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce will just get married, then it'll, okay, all right, so, all right.
At least if they have a kid together.
Okay, yeah, okay, all right, okay, yeah, so, all right.
I'm glad yeah.
I couldn't resist, sorry.
I mean, we should all do what Taylor does, so I'm down with that. No, but you know what? Taylor Swift's told people to go register for vote, and how many of them went to register to vote?
A
right?
lot, right?
A lot.
Yeah.
So you're total. It's actually, I know you were joking, but that's a really good example. People do what Taylor Swift says.
Yeah.
I mean, my daughters do, right? So, but that kind of thing, and also, like. In 2008, Obama made an incredible speech on Father's Day, talking about how many dads were missing from homes and how it was a problem. I don't think a Democratic leader would make that speech today. And I think that matters. I think more people listen to like Kim Kardashian or Taylor Swift than President Biden, frankly. But all of the leaders, what they say matters. And I also hear from like local pastors that they won't touch this subject because they worry it will alienate their congregation. I think what local pastors say to their congregants matters. You know, Diane mentioned my study on 16 and Pregnant. 16 and Pregnant was designed just as an as an entertaining television show, but actually the depictions of the difficulties of being a pregnant and teen mom led to a reduction in teen childbearing. What Disney or Netflix decides to put on TV matters. And so, you know, if we're not committed to this idea of sort of moral relativism, not saying anything about any families being better or worse, not being honest about the hardships that under-resourced one-parent homes tend to experience, then that will affect what kids grow up to do. So I think all that matters. And then the final thing I'll just say, though, as a, you know, on a sort of more immediate policy response to the situation and challenges I describe in the book, there are groups around the country working with vulnerable families. They are largely underfunded. There's very little money available to research and study such efforts, and that needs to change, right? I think we should be spending more money on early childhood education, on programs to help students get through college, but we also should be investing in programs and building evidence around these types of programs that meet families where they are and works to strengthen them. So I'll start there.
All right. Hopefully, some of you have some questions now. There's certainly a lot to chew on there, so let's hear from. All right, this gentleman right here. Oh, okay, and here comes the mic. Okay. Okay. There was one here in the black shirt. Yes.
Hi, fantastic talk.
Thanks.
My question that kind of immediately came to mind as soon as you started talking is, where does contraception and access to abortion play in this, and encouraging people to have children later in life when they might be in a position more suited to raising children?
Yeah, excellent question. And we didn't cover this at all, so I'm glad you raised it. Very, very interestingly, everything I describe about the rise in kids living in single mother homes in particular has happened despite a major reduction in birth rates and actually a phenomenal reduction in teen birth rates. So teen births are down 70% from the mid-90s. Moms are older now and more educated. And part of that is because of, you know, the trends you're talking about. Contraception has become more readily available. Contraceptive technology has improved. And so we've seen that women are delaying childbearing. Teen childbearing has fallen. If you told me in 1996 what was going to happen to birth rates among teen women and women in their young 20s, I would have predicted a very large reduction in the share of kids in single-parent homes. But what happened instead was, even though sort of birth rates to younger, less advantaged women decreased, there was this debundling of having kids and being married. And so I don't give as much sort of credence in the book to further expanding access to contraception as a policy response, because birth rates are already down. And so even though all of that is very important, what's driving this is not, increased birth rates to young women, women who tend to, groups that tended to have higher rates of single parenthood. It's very, very clearly in the data driven by a reduction in marriage, as opposed to, let's say, rampant unintended pregnancies.
David at the back.
Thank you very much for that talk. Is this on? Okay. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to reading the book. I wanted to ask a little bit, so obviously pushing a little bit on the two-parent idea, because, if the official explanation, and I think there's a lot to it, the pooling of economic resources, right? So someone might say, well, why not the three-parent privilege or the four-parent privilege?
Somebody says that every time.
Or the five or the six, right? So
She's heard it all, David.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking of certain kind of Brave New World scenarios or certain kind of arguments that Marxists might make about sort of communal. It literally takes a village, and so let's just pull it all together. So maybe I'm thinking more, because there are arguments actually on the other side that say actually the most economically prosperous societies are monogamous ones where there are strong norms of monogamy. So there's a book by William Tucker called Marriage and Civilization, How Monogamy Made Us Human, making sort of arguments along these effects. The most egalitarian societies are monogamous, the most economically prosperous, the most peaceful. So if you want to have overall good outcomes, you should really encourage monogamy. It's key to civilization. Now, I don't think all those arguments are purely economic, but there's economic ramifications for sure. So anyways, I was just interested in your thoughts on that. And I will say, whatever your answer may be, I'm going to have to leave because I have to go coach my son's baseball team. So it's not because I'm upset. So, all right, thanks.
Okay, good. Then I'll answer really quickly. Is he a philosopher?
He is, yes.
Okay.
How could you tell?
So I'll tell you how I know this is because the Washington Post book reviewer from this weekend hated my book so much, and she is an ABD student in philosophy, and she says I'm terribly uncreative because instead of sticking with this idea that we needed more two-parent homes, what we needed was more communal raising of children. Okay, so, first of all, because I live in data and practicality, let me start at the very beginning. I am fully convinced that, it takes a village to raise a kid. As a practical matter, what we see is single moms are not making up for the absence of a second parent in their home with very strong villages. So only, 67% of those kids do not have another adult in the house. So it's not that grandparents or aunts or uncles or best friends are living with the single mom to help make up for it. Nor could I find any evidence that kids living with single moms were more likely to see their grandparents or extended family regularly. So I think, in some sense, what you might say is in the US now, the emphasis on a nuclear family without a village combined with the rise in one-parent families is what's really making this a disastrous situation. Two, I have gotten this critique, not just from this philosopher book reviewer, but also from sort of avowed socialists who have said, my prescription ultimately is wrong, and what we need is for the state to take more responsibility for raising kids. And my reaction really to that is I am all for more public funding to take care of kids, but an expanded child tax credit, you know what? You're going to coach your kid's baseball team. Dads have value to their children far beyond what a taxpayer-funded check or government program can give them.
But Melissa, you don't know how much they're paying him to coach that team. So.
Or how good he is at it, right? But I actually think very, very seriously, dads do a lot. The missing dad, those kids are missing out on a lot more than I've seen any reason to think more public programs can take care of. And then finally, the final thing I'll say about communal responsibility for kids, when you look at the communities in the US where there's been a breakdown in the two-parent family, those are very vulnerable, distressed communities. And I just, again, as a practical level, what communal raising of kids, right? More often we have a whole bunch of really disadvantaged kids missing out on second parents. And I'm not seeing an excess of parental love and support to make up for that. All right, good luck in your game.
James, can you swing over there? Would that be too burdensome? Sorry. Dr. Hooks is swift of foot with that microphone.
Thank you for your wonderful speech, Professor. I love this book because it's strong argument and compelling evidence. So what is the most significant difficult for maintaining a two-parent family?
Yeah, this is a really important question, and why I think it's so important that we do have programs that are meeting families where they are today, right? To say, what are the barriers? I can just tell you a little bit, like what I've read from some of these programs that are trying to work with families on healthy relationships. So for example, there's a whole movement on responsible fatherhood programs. And what do those programs do? They really work with, dads on how to be a co-parent, communication, parenting. And ultimately, the programs that have been studied are a bit disappointing because it doesn't look like you see the moms and dads more likely to be together, et cetera. And qualitatively, what some of the researchers have suggested is, a lot of those dads are unstably employed or have, in and out of prison, and that makes it really hard. So there are just in some of these instances, there are very practical barriers: lack of stable employment, criminal involvement or criminal justice involvement, substance abuse. Those are some of them. My view on this is 40% of the kids in the US now are born to unmarried parents. Almost 37% are living with only one, outside a married parent home. It's not the case that all of those dads are out of work or all of those parents have some sort of mental health challenge or substance abuse. So there are some barriers, but then I think some of that population is also characterized by ambivalence about whether they should get married or not. And so, I think it's really hard. Like, I think there's a huge variation. The easiest ones, maybe, to change their minds are to say, do you know how beneficial this is going to be for you or your kid? And this is where I think sort of the normalization of the one-parent household has probably been really counterproductive. So I think there's a big range. Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's go do right here.
What was striking to me was that you mentioned the college-educated class. So at the end of the day, it seems that the goal is to have children who end up college-educated and thus can command a larger income. So to what degree is the college education the factor that's driving good childhood outcomes? To what extent do college-educated mothers also produce good outcomes for their children? And if they produce great outcomes, which they probably do perhaps to a lesser degree than in married households, is the kind of the reconstruction of marriage since the 19th century not a feminist story? You talked about that your book is not anti-feminist because in the early 19th century, marriage was kind of often arranged, patriarchally driven, etc. And it was the kind of the feminist movement, the liberation of women, the possibility of their education that allowed for dating in the first place, that allowed for kind of compatibility matches, and therefore successful marriages for children and families. So to what extent is college education, firstly, the driver of success, and marriage one of those indicators of success in the first place? And secondly, is your use of class with reference to the college educated a kind of a normal usage among economists? And if not, why do you choose to talk about the college educated class? That seems...
All right, let me answer the second one first. I gave very little thought to that word, that that seems pretty typical for economists, right? Like, yeah, so I mean nothing by that word, except trying to identify as opposed to a group. Yeah, that's all I really meant. Does the word have greater meaning for you than that, or we just?
Typically, it's associated more with kind of purchasing and consuming potential, right? So it's in the U.S. context, in the world context, it's more associated with the gens or the kind of the genealogy of a group, right? Whether they are noble, in some way privileged historically or not.
Yeah, that was just sort of a language shortcut to refer to them as a socioeconomic class or an educated class. And so I just sort of very boringly say I define class by education level.
You could just easily say cohort or group or...
Well, cohort we tend to think of as like age when they were born. So anyway, so I mean nothing specific. I mean nothing interesting by that term. The bigger question about college as a marker, I mean, this is both, very much a cause and effect. And so this is why, I'm focused on this as a class-based issue, why I title the book A Privilege. College is a marker of success in all sorts of ways. And then we see that that class or group of people is more likely to actually be able to achieve, and I do think of it as achieve, this other very advantageous marker, which is raising your kid in a married parent home. And so the advantages up there are compounding. And just very specifically, it's really interesting. I wound up wondering, I think along the same lines of what you're asking, now that moms are college educated, maybe it doesn't matter so much if they're married or not. Now again, married moms are much less likely to be unpartnered. So let's be clear about that. Only 12% of kids whose moms have a college degree are living with an unpartnered mom as compared to 30% of everyone else, okay? So they're much less likely to find themselves in this position. But one of the things I asked a few years ago when someone was asking me like, I started wondering, so much of the literature on single motherhood was tightly wound up with the question of poverty because again, historically, single moms were teen moms, very poor moms. And as single motherhood has become more common, especially among women who are more educated, in particular, like lots of high school educated moms, I thought, well, maybe it doesn't matter so much anymore. And so then I called Phil Levine, who I often write papers with. I'm like, have you seen anything on this? He's like, no, that's why we wrote this paper about the marriage premium and think about this heterogeneity. So what do we find? College educated moms who are unmarried are almost always able to keep their child out of poverty. But when you look at kids whose moms are college educated, whether they complete college by age 25, they're twice as likely if their mom is married. Why? Because basically getting through college is a really high achievement, and it's not until you're looking at 2 college-educated married parents that a majority of their children graduate college. And this actually gets back to the Marxist point, quite frankly, which is, some of the reaction I'm getting is, we should just do more to keep single moms out of poverty. Yes, we should do more to keep single moms out of poverty, okay? But actually, what I'd really like to do is have more of an equitable opportunity across the, all kids and whether they could do things, not just avoid poverty, but graduate college. And I don't think we're ever gonna sort of have government programs or a safety net program big enough to close those gaps. So even among the more advantaged moms, you see a gap in kids' outcomes based on whether, there's the resources of 2 parents or 1.
Yes.
So I want to dig a little bit into some of the economics studies that we didn't talk about in this case. And so I'm going to describe some of these, though you can cut me off and you can take over describing them.
No, go for it.
So I think of 2 different types of studies that look at what happened when men with low levels of education saw increases in their wages. One was in the 1980s with the coal boom, right? And what happened was coal miners saw their wages go up and they got married more and they had more children. Then subsequently, you've got a study that looked at the fracking boom. I have a student who had a similar approach looking at the ethanol boom. In both cases, we saw increases in low-skilled men's wages. In the modern time, they still have more kids. They don't get married.
Right.
Tell me how you interpret that and how that makes, or how do we
Yeah.
feel good about then improving the marriageability of men?
Exactly. So this was a study that sort of made me change my mind about things. So for a long time, what I would say when asked what do we have to do about this, I'd say improve the economic position of non-college educated men. So then, we talked about the China shock, the industrial robots, all these things that were really bad for non-college educated men. The one good thing, sort of in a structural level, was these localized fracking brooms throughout the country that, as Diane said, really increased the earnings and employment of men without college degrees, more so than women. So you've got both the absolute and relative improvement. So Riley Wilson and I looked at what happened in these in these communities around the country, not North Dakota. We know there was a lot of migration there. We looked there. And what do we see? Okay, we see that, there was an increase in births, no increase in marriage, no reduction, tight zero on non-marital birth share. And that's when we revisited the coal boom and bust, which earlier researchers had found increased married births, but they only looked at married births. So we're like, well, that was a very similar shock in similar communities, but you got a very different family formation response. And that, my interpretation of that, is part of what led me to this view that it's not just economics, but the way people respond to an economic shock is determined by the social paradigm they're living in. So even when you just looked at fracking communities, you saw a larger increase in non-marital births in communities where there was already a higher rate of non-marital births at baseline. And then this contrast with the 70s and 80s coal boom and bust period is really, I think, more confirmation of that idea that the social paradigm dictates how people respond to the economics. It makes it a much harder, intractable problem, because it suggests even if we could do all of these things that we think we need to do to improve the economic position of these non-college educated men, if we're now living in a paradigm where there's been such a disruption of the social convention of having and raising your kids inside marriage, things aren't necessarily going to turn around.
So culture and norms are really the
Which is,
important thing.
a little bit painful for me as an economist to admit, because it's a lot harder for me to pull different economic policy levers to turn those things around.
It all comes back to Taylor Swift and Travis Kelce. So they just got to set a good example. So I'll quit banging on about that. We had a couple of other, right here in the front also, James. Right here. Yeah, you've been waiting patiently. Thanks.
So thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I was actually looking forward to read this book.
Good.
And yeah, I have two questions actually. So can you talk a little bit more about what happens with households that have both parents married, but there is only one source of income? Is there any difference? And the other one is, like, you mentioned that you had interviews with unmarried couples that were living together. So my question is, why are they deciding to have kids, considering the availability of contraceptives here in the US, and that it's very easy to get married also, and all the tax benefits that are when you get married? So why they decide to have kids but not to get married?
Yeah, so, wait, what was your first question?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Okay, so actually, this is something that I'm really agnostic about, and as one of the issues I decided not to try and describe, which is how one of the ways I kept the book to 200 pages, so it's easy to read. But I am agnostic about how two-parent couples make it work, whether one of them is home during the whole child's childhood, whether both of them work part-time, whether one works part-time, whether they alternate who's working full-time or part-time. And my view on this, again, from a resource perspective, is the basic idea is that a household with two parents versus one, they have more degrees of freedom. They have more ways to optimize. They have more ways to decide this is what's best for our family. And so there are studies out there looking at, how much sort of less maternal time with young children is weighed against the benefits of more income and sort of, that whole thing. And I deliberately eschew those issues just to say, in general, we know that two parents can, they get more different more arrangements at their disposal over the child's childhood, and so I'm agnostic about that. The second question, why do these couples, why do adults have kids together and not get married? It's a really big question that I don't have a very clear answer to. I'm not the one who did these interviews. I've read some of these ethnographic studies, and sort of unsurprisingly, what you hear from some of these vignettes is that for some of these young women, they find themselves pregnant, they decide to have the child because that's one of the really good things they can do in their life, right? The child brings them meaning, brings them joy, even if they don't have a stable partner. And so, again, I don't come down very strongly as others would. Like, if you are not able to be married to someone, you should not have a child, because, I'd be the first to admit, like, I love being a mom. And so I don't think the answer is that millions of these women shouldn't be moms because of the struggles with their partners. But this gets to part of what's so hard about these questions is, if your relationship isn't stable enough to be married, why are you having a kid together? I can't really answer that. And so where I sort of come down is, how can we help more people? Sort of, again, I think of it as an achievement to be able to have a healthy, marriage or co-parenting relationship for all of these years.
Carl.
So I was just curious whether there are any significant regional or geographical variances in the data for sort of outcomes for single-parented children, and if there are, does that suggest anything about effective policies or other levers that you could pull to help children in single-family homes?
Yeah, this is something I really wanted to be able to say more definitive about. I've looked to see, and I think there's more to be learned from this, but I've just looked to see, do we not see such gaps in outcomes in European states where there's much stronger welfare systems or government provision of programs? My general read of the evidence there is that other countries do a better job of keeping single moms and their kids out of poverty. But even in Scandinavian countries, you see that family structure and kids' background really matters for, outcomes. So, what does this tell me? We could be and we should be doing more to help these parents and their kids. But it makes me less sanguine to think that it's going to be easy to just sort of strengthen some government programs and close these gaps in a bigger way.
We've got time for one more question. This gentleman over here.
Thank you. My name is Guibert. My wife and I, we support couples. We do marriage support for couples. We're not therapists, but we do coaching and support that way. And what we've found is that a lot of educated women who are married, let me say it differently. So oftentimes, a lot of the women who are old, who decide to get married later in life, get married later in life because they had a hard time maybe meeting someone during the college years, during those prime years, to link up with, who are of the same mindset, et cetera, same values, et cetera. And sometimes they marry someone who is not college educated in order to have somebody to love. And we found that in those relationships, there's a lot of challenges, a lot of difficulty. Sometimes they end up in divorce. And I found it interesting when you were talking, I think in your book, I haven't read your book yet, but I was listening to some interviews that you did, that it's not divorced parents where you see a hybrid of single moms. It's more of people who are choosing to have children before and not get married. We found some of those as well. And I think oftentimes a lot of it has to do with, one, they can't find somebody to be with, somebody who has the same values. And so they meet someone and end up having a child, but not willing to get married to the person because they don't meet the same level of education or values, etc. And will choose to keep the child because they have a child, they want to keep the child, they love the child. I think family history has a lot to do with the cycle that we're seeing in moms or dads just having children but not getting married. And it's hard to throw money at that in order for people to now say, hey, let's get married. Money's not going to solve that. And I love the research you just mentioned as well, because I was thinking, well, maybe if some of the guys had more money, they'd be more likely willing to get married. And that's not necessarily the case. We have couples, as I mentioned to you, who are married but to someone who's not as educated or may not have had a college education and are now wanting to get out of the relationship because they don't value it as much. The marriage institution is not as much value to them as, say, just being on their own or doing whatever. So I wonder if there's a way to address family history. I'm not sure how much we can affect culture, but it's something that we can do to just change the mindset or somewhat break the cycle to help families or individuals make better choices in relationships when they're in college, or if they're not in college, in high school, coming out of only high school educated, to decide, hey, listen, I'm better off linking up with somebody in marriage and having a child than doing this on my own. How do we break that cycle so that they can choose marriage first before having children?
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing those observations. I mean, this is the kind of conversation that I was hoping to basically generate with this book, to say, here, I'm an economist. I realize that a lot of our economic policy levers aren't going to solve this major problem. And now, what do we do as a society? What do we do with these kinds of programs? This gets to your question of, like, how do we change hearts and minds and culture, right? And I'm becoming increasingly convinced it's like one program, one couple at a time, right? And so folks like you who sort of do this with one couple, right, at a time. And I don't know if you know the work of Ian Rowe. He's a scholar at AEI, but he's reached out to me with all this work. He runs a charter school in New York, and he teaches kids at a high school level, basically what is referred to as the success sequence, which is sort of what you're talking about. It's like, make these choices. And, you know, for those of us looking for, like, oh, we just need to pass this federal legislation, it's, you know, it's a little bit, maybe it's actually just talking to young people and especially, but I mean, this speaks to what you were saying. This is what's necessary to break this cycle, because you have all these kids growing up without the example of a married couple, and so they don't aspire to it, they don't know how to achieve it. And so, you know, having folks like you and programs like that sort of try to break the cycle on the ground is, I think, probably a really critical part of the solution or way to forward.
All right. Well, we are just about out of time. I hope you found this a stimulating and challenging and convicting and inspiring conversation. Melissa, may I ask, would you be willing to sign copies of your book if people bring them up? Okay, all right. So, okay, great to have your opportunity. And
nope, I'm out of here.
Yeah, and don't try to sell your signed copies on eBay for the 10 times the amount they will get you, although she is kind of a rock star right now, right? So anyway, please join me in thanking Melissa. Okay.
Thank you.